Hi, everybody. Joe Dispenza here, along with Lynne McTaggart. We're excited to spend an hour with you all and talk about some of our latest discoveries. And Lynne, give you an opportunity to say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you.
This morning, I was thinking that I probably met you. It's been 20 years since we met, because I remember we went to lunch together, and your children were really young, and your husband Brian and you and I and your kids went to lunch, and that started our relationship. And we have some things in common. We're from the same part of the United States. We have some ethnic similarities, and from that point on, we've always been really good friends. We've done duets together, we've lectured together, and always had a great friendship. So I think the reason that we decided to do this was because we both released our books at the exact same time. And we were in London just a couple months ago having some tea together. And we were asking each other what we learned. And you've been busy, I've been busy. And there's so many similarities in what we've discovered. And I thought it would be really great, or we thought it would be really great to share some of those discoveries and see if we can build a bigger model of understanding.
Yeah, and I mean, this is probably going to be a revelation for everyone. I mean, particularly about me, because everybody thinks I'm British because I live over in the UK, but I got hijacked by my husband who is British, but I'm actually from New Jersey. And here's the great thing, so is Joe. So we found I'm probably from a better part of New Jersey than Joe is, but we're both from New Jersey, which really grounds you. I mean, you'd have to know about New Jersey, and Bruce Springsteen and all of that to understand that. And the other fun thing about it is we're both Italian. Despite my last name, McTaggart, I'm Italian too. And so we get to talk about recipes and what our grandmothers did and all kinds of fun stuff like that too, as well as quantum physics.
And your latest book, The Power of Eight, is such a profound book. I read it and did an endorsement for you. But gosh, I mean, your books, The Intention Experiment and The Field, had such a dramatic effect on the consciousness of this wonderful planet we live on. And The Power of Eight is such an extension of that work. And I know you've done a lot of intention experiments on the power of healing and on a massive global scale. But I guess my question for you is, what made you decide to go down to 8 people, and what was the reason behind all of that?
Okay, Joe, thank you for that. I had just started the intention experiments in 2007, and they really were launched from a great sense of skepticism. I mean, I come from a background as an investigative reporter, and so that kind of inquiring, skeptical mindset has never left me. And so this was right after the turn of the millennium, when a lot of things were floating around about the law of attraction and The Secret, and I'd finished the field studies demonstrating that thoughts are an actual something with the capacity to change physical matter. So I wondered to myself, wait a minute. I mean, I really didn't believe this. And I said, okay, how far can we take this? Can we cure cancer with our thoughts? And also, what happens when lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? So that's why I launched the intention experiment as one great big giant experiment to see if this really were true. And we've run 30 to date, and 26 have shown measurable, positive, mostly significant effects. Everything from trying to make seeds to grow faster, to lowering violence, to trying to heal somebody of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But I also wondered whether I could scale this down to a workshop. And I hadn't run many workshops before when I started to do this. I remember Joe and I ran a workshop together right about this time when I was just trying to feel my way. And I thought, well, I don't know. I'll put people in groups. One day I was talking to my husband about it, trying to figure out how to show that people can manifest things over a weekend workshop. So I'm sitting there talking to my husband and I go, oh, I don't know. I'll put them in groups of 8 or so and have them send intention to somebody with a health challenge and see what happens. And he said, because he's a great headline writer, great, the power of 8, I like it. And so that's how it started. I put people in groups of 8, had them send healing intention to somebody with a health challenge in the group. And I thought it was going to be a little feel-good exercise, like having a facial or something.
When people are beginning to change their inner state, I wanted to look at what was happening in real time. I wanted to see the inner workings of what takes place when a person truly gets beyond themselves. And so measuring brain changes in real time caused me to be able to understand how to teach it a little bit better. So the quantitative studies showed, boy, when a person truly gets beyond themselves, the brain gets more organized, it gets more coherent. Their heart, we've been measuring heart coherence as well, and we've partnered with the Heart Math Institute. And it requires, I think, a clear intention and an elevated emotion to begin to have an effect on matter, whether it's in your body or in the field around you. And if you're trying to think positively, but you're feeling frustration and resentment, that thought really doesn't make it to the body, because thoughts are the language of the brain and feelings are the language of the body, and how we think and feel creates our state of being. So there's a misalignment that takes place. By the same means, emotions are energy. And so when we're living by the emotions of frustration and resentment, it can't carry the thought of healing, because that frequency can't carry that information. It carries the thoughts equal to that emotional state. So I wanted to teach people how to regulate internal states and be able to sustain those states independent of the conditions in their external environment, which means then if we measure it and we can see that a person's doing it and a person keeps practicing, they'll get better at it. And if we have cancer shrinking in a person's body in 1 week and tumors beginning to change and blood values beginning to become altered in 1 weekend, then there must be some type of gene that's being upregulated and another gene that's being downregulated. So we've measured genetic expression, and you're not doomed by your genes. That we're marvels of adaptability and change. And you take a group of people and you have them think differently, you have them do different things, you have them have new experiences, you have them make different choices, you have them feel differently. That's new information coming from the environment, and it should begin to epigenetically change our gene expression. And genes make proteins, and proteins are responsible for the structure and function of a person's body. And the expression of proteins is the expression of life. So what is it that causes us to get stuck in certain patterns and begin to make those changes? So we've measured everything that we could possibly measure, and we're measuring telomeres now, because I want people to realize how powerful we really are. And when people start to heal and they're no longer relying on anything outside of them, but they're relying on the resources within them, and they can begin to make strides and changes in their own personal health and their life, the moment they start seeing feedback, whether it's in their body, if something changes in their body or something happens in their environment, a synchronicity and a coincidence, a serendipity, they're changing their energy. And when they change their energy, they change their life. And I know that nobody changes after all these years of studying this until they change their energy. So to silence the critics, I decided to write that book, because some of the measurements that we've been getting validate those supernatural experiences that people have. And you can't tell me you're too old to do this any longer. You can't tell me you're too sick to do this any longer. You can't tell me you're too out of shape. You can't tell me that your past was too difficult. You can't tell me that you never meditated or done this work before, because we've seen transformation and change in all shapes and all sizes and all cultures, all skin colors, whether you're a vegetarian or you're carnivore, whether you're heterosexual or bisexual, it doesn't matter. It's just that I think we have the capacity to really begin to create a better life for ourselves. And when we see that feedback coming from our outer world, we start correlating what we did in our inner world to produce that effect. And I think that's when we move from being a victim of our life to become more aware that we're the creator of our lives. And I think that when people see that, and begin to see someone stand on the stage and say, hey, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had this really turbulent past. I did the work. It took me 2 years to heal myself. And they tell that story. And it's not perfect. And they don't look like a movie star or a sports figure. And they're not all young and they're not all buffed. that people start resonating with the understanding that it is possible for them. And I think that the change in consciousness that we're beginning to see because of information tells us that it's readily available for other people to do the same. And so we've seen that so many times, and I'm certain that you've seen the same. And one of the things that fascinated me about your book was the concept of the mirror effect. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, what was so interesting to me about the intention experiment at first was something untoward that happened. When I ran my first peace intention experiment in 2008, we focused on Sri Lanka. We tried to send intention to lower violence there. And the evidence, I used a team of scientists to monitor the effects, and we looked at the effects from 2 years before to a few months afterward to establish whether or not we had bucked a long-standing trend. Because if you just look at the week after someone sent an intention and there's some lowering of violence, that says nothing scientifically. So we did. It looked like we bucked the trend. It was really interesting, but that isn't the point of the story, and it certainly wasn't the interesting part of it. As a kind of side thing, just to find out what the experience had been for my participants, I sent them out a very detailed questionnaire. And it was really essentially to find out whether or not they could get on the internet, because these are all experiments we've done on internet sites where everybody comes together from around the world to send intention to some place or something. And I started getting back things like this. I felt like I was hooked up to a higher network. I had uncontrollable tingling in my body. I was sobbing throughout the whole thing. And this was thousands of people writing about this. I felt like I was the tractor beam in Star Trek. And they were also describing big changes in their lives. They were describing a mystical experience. I mean, they had every category that Abraham Maslow writes about when he writes about mystical experiences. You know, this intense altered state, this feeling of oneness, this blinding epiphany of meaning, life suddenly makes sense to them, and big rejuvenation in their lives. They had all of these. But something else was happening. They were mirroring the effect of the intention. So if we focused on peace as the intention, their lives became more peaceful. It was radiating out into their lives. They were making up with longest estranged partners or family members. They were getting along better with their not so nice boss. They were in love with everybody they were coming in contact with. That was the almost a majority of people were saying, I'm in love with everyone I come in contact with. They were hugging strangers, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I thought, whoa, this is weird. And then when we ran a healing intention experiment, similarly, people started healing. They started healing long-standing conditions. But it didn't just happen in the big, and I'm talking about everything from arthritis to and people had long-standing conditions, and suddenly, after participating, they were better. So the senders, and it wasn't just their physical being that was healing, but their lives were healing. I'll give you a wonderful example that I just had about 6 weeks ago with a guy called Wes. Now, Wes was a Vietnam vet. He was going to go to university. He was in college in his third year, and the lottery was still in effect. He had a low number, and draft deferments were then abolished. So he got drafted, and he couldn't do anything about it. So he had to go to Vietnam for the very last year of the war. This traumatized him, and he ended up coming home being very depressed, and his life sort of spiraled downward from there on in. And the only bright spark in his life was marrying his second wife, and she ended up dying of cancer. It was just terrible. One thing after another. He was in terrible debt after that to pay for medical bills. Awful. So here he is at 65 feeling like, what's the use? Hard to even get out of bed, almost impossible to even make himself a meal. So he participates in one of these power-based groups at the Mile High Church, and I interview him a couple of days later, and it's a totally different Wes speaking. He said, I woke up the next day, and he wasn't the recipient. He was sending intention to a woman with cancer. The next day he wakes up and he says, the grass was greener, the flowers smelled better. Suddenly my life, I feel I'm bounding out of bed. I'm making lunch for myself. And he started doing these 90-minute power walks. He got back into writing. He even had an amazing dream where he met his 19-year-old self. And his 19-year-old self said to him, it was more a feeling than saying it, but hey, there's still time. And suddenly he's got back his life. He's in love with his life again. And that I've seen over and over and over again. And that's the most extraordinary thing to me, is this rebound mirror effect that happens in small groups, that the sender is benefiting every bit as much as the receiver, that there's something about that altruistic and communal act that is creating this change. Mm. Now, we've looked at it. I mean, I've looked at what's going on in the brain. And here's another connection with Joe. The brainwave studies we've done have been carried out by neuroscientists at Life University, which happens to be the university that Joe went for his chiropractic training. Another wonderful connection. But we've looked at brainwave studies, and we've also looked at what happens when people get off of themselves and do something altruistic. And we found something really extraordinary. We found that what happens when you do something like that is you fire a thing called the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body. It winds around all your major organs, and it also turns on certain aspects of your body involved in caretaking, love, and commitment, things like the release of oxytocin. But it also, and this has been demonstrated by studies at the University of California at Berkeley, makes people more loving toward people not like them, more tolerant, more connected in every way. And it has a virtuous circle effect on the immune systems of the body. So it would help to create that kind of joy. And there's been so much evidence about altruism demonstrating that it is essentially like a bulletproof vest.
Mm. I love this because this is a very similar thing that we've seen over and over again, because when we live in survival, we're living in stress, and people spend about 70% of their time living by these emotions of aggression and anger and fear and anxiety and depression and pain and suffering. And it's these emotions then that cause us to feel separate from that field. We feel disconnected. The very hormones of stress cause us to narrow our focus on matter, because that's where the danger is. And when the arousal takes place in the brain and the body, we switch on the sympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of the vagus nerve. And now we're in emergency mode, and we're always trying to predict the future based on our experience of the past. And we focus our attention on the material world because our senses are heightened by those very chemicals. So the arousal of those chemicals becomes intoxicating for many people. And so then they don't know they're doing this, but they're using the problems and conditions in their life, the memories of their past, to create those same emotional states, so that they keep conditioning their body further and further into those self-limiting or selfish states. So then they want to overcome themselves. They don't want to feel that way, but they think that they have to analyze their life within that emotion. And our research shows that when we do that, we actually make our brains worse. In other words, when you're thinking within that emotion is a record of the past. You're thinking in the past. So then going from a selfish state to a selfless state means then you have to open your heart. You have to give. And that selfless state is really innately who we are when we're not living in separation and survival. We are naturally wired to care and to give and to connect and to cooperate. And so when people start to do something for another person and they start really giving, their energy shifts automatically and their heart begins to become more coherent. And when the heart becomes more coherent, it begins to produce a measurable magnetic field. And that field, that energy, is a frequency. And that frequency then begins to cause us to feel more like energy, less like matter, more like wave and less like particle. We're connecting to something greater. That's our connection to the field when we open our heart. And then laying a thought or an intent for somebody, it can be carried on that frequency. And all of a sudden, you're broadcasting a whole new signature. Now, not only does it have an effect on the field and producing changes around you, but all of a sudden, you begin to get beyond yourself. Now, this is a very interesting phenomenon because we've studied this. And I can say without a doubt, 100%, that you and I and everybody, they're at their absolute best when they get beyond themselves. When they no longer are preoccupied with the way they look or the pain in their body. They're not thinking about the people in their lives. They're not focused on things and objects like cell phones and computers and shopping. And they're not thinking about where they need to go or how much time it's going to take. This act of no one, in nothing, in nowhere, in no time, means then you're taking your attention off of everything material. And what is material in our three-dimensional world? What is our environment made of? It's made of bodies and people and objects and things and places. So if you take your attention off them, where you place your attention is where you place your energy. So if you're taking your attention off this three-dimensional world, it makes sense then that you're no longer experiencing reality with your senses, and you go from the realm of the material to the realm of the immaterial. Now, it's a natural phenomenon for us to do this. It's just how we're wired. And when we do this properly, we become pure consciousness. And when we're pure consciousness, you enter the field. Now, when that occurs, the brain becomes very organized and very coherent. The heart becomes very organized and very coherent. And when the brain begins to no longer narrow its focus on matter and begin to open up and begin to feel safe and begin to think about something other than ourself, we're no longer in local space and time. We're connecting to something greater. Now, the field begins to produce an effect on matter. And Einstein said the field is the sole governing agency of the particle. And most people think that matter emits a field, but the more I study, it seems like it's the field that creates matter. So when you change the field, you change matter, which means there's a downward causation phenomenologically from energy to circuitry to chemistry to neurotransmitters like oxytocin and nitric oxide to genetic changes, and all of a sudden a switch can go on. Now, when people truly connect to that energy and they're getting beyond themselves, their consciousness is connecting to a greater consciousness, that consciousness of the field. Now, consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. So they're caught up in the present moment. And when they're in the present moment, all possibilities exist in the quantum field. And all of a sudden, we see in an instant, in literally an instant, a biological upgrade. And it's not matter that's changing matter. It's energy that begins to change matter. So teaching people how to get beyond themselves and go from that kind of aroused high beta brainwave state where you're trying to anticipate the next moment and you're shifting your attention from one person to one problem to one thing in one place, that's why most people can't sit still and meditate, because that's been habituated. So if you teach people then to go from a narrow focus on matter all of a sudden to opening up and sensing nothing in energy and information, all of a sudden where you place your attention is where you place your energy, and all of a sudden you start connecting to that field. So then directing energy then either towards an outcome or directing energy to create something in your life, you will start to see then your heart starts to open, you become more altruistic, you become more giving, you become more kind, you become more caring. Energy is shifted in your body as well. And we've seen all kinds of changes in the immune system when this happens. I mean, cortisol levels drop, the stress hormones go down, and all of a sudden the immune system gets a huge reboot. I mean, by 50% just in 4 days. Now, if a pharmaceutical company was manufacturing manufacturing a drug that can strengthen your immune system by 50%, that substance would be on every television commercial, and yet our nervous system is the greatest pharmacist in the world. Now, most people can say, yeah, I accept that. That sounds really great. But on some level, we're conditioned into programmed into believing that we need something outside of us to change how we feel inside of us. And what we're seeing, I think, you and I, is that people are making those changes inside of themselves, and it's beginning to produce an effect in their outer world. And when you get that kind of change and the immune system comes back online and the vagus nerve turns on that nervous system of relaxation and hormones start to change, that the body goes back into growth and repair. The body gets kind of a reboot. And in a matter of moments, when you have that kind of inner experience, and again, we've been lucky enough to capture that transcendental moment over and over again, the brain becomes very aroused, the body becomes very aroused, but the arousal is not coming from the stress hormones, from some stimulation in the outer world. It's almost as if the body is releasing energy back into the heart and into the brain, and all of a sudden the brain becomes aroused, and they're having an inner experience. And their brain waves go from those slower alpha and theta waves. Those slower brain waves become carriers. And all of a sudden, the brain goes into this gamma brainwave state. And now the person is having an inner event that is more real than their past trauma, their past shock, their past betrayal. Now, when the brain goes into this state, all of a sudden now, when there's a change in their emotional state, when there's a change in energy, whenever we notice a change in our internal state, in our normal life, we pay attention to what causes it in our outer world, and the brain takes a snapshot, and that's called the memory. That's how we create long-term memories. The stronger the emotional trauma, the more we remember the cause of it. So then people get caught in thinking neurologically within the circuits of that experience, and they tend to feel chemically within the boundaries of those emotions, and their entire state of being is in the past. So then when a person has an inner event where they just let go and they forget everything and get beyond themselves, when they have a change in their inner state and they feel such incredible peace or incredible love or freedom or gratitude, and it's different than anything they've ever felt before, it's not coming from their outer world. It's coming from that energy that's carrying a message, it's carrying information. And all of a sudden now, that experience, since experience produces an emotion, all of a sudden now, in a matter of seconds, it's like their past is literally washed away because the inner event and the amplitude of that emotion is greater than the experience that created the problem in the first place. And all of a sudden, the person is literally reborn again. Now, the amount of energy that we've seen when this happens is, in other words, 99.7% of the population falls within 3 standard deviations above normal and 3 standard deviations below normal, whether it's eyesight, whether it's height, whether it's liver enzymes, whether it's intellect. This bell curve pretty much gives us, the top of the bell curve gives us about 68% of what we call normal. And then you have some people with a little better eyesight, a little worse eyesight. You have people with really great eyesight and really bad eyesight. That's 99.7% of the population. Now, when we see this over and over again, when those people get into that aroused superconscious state, the energy in their brain is 200 to 300 to 400 standard deviations outside of normal. Now, as that line gets lower and lower, it gets lesser and lesser. That's outstanding. That is supernatural. So that person will tell you, that was real to me. It was almost as if they're having a full-on sensory experience without their senses. And that new memory replaces the old memory, and all of a sudden, they're perceiving the reality differently because we don't perceive things the way they are. We perceive things the way we are. So all of a sudden, the brain gets a reorganization of circuitry, and they're no longer seeing their life through the lens of the past. The emotion then begins to condition the body to a new mind, and since the environment signals the gene, and the end product of an experience in the environment is an emotion, it makes sense then that new elevated emotion is really upregulating new genes and downregulating old genes. And people get their hearing back, they get diseases go away in an instant because they're moving closer and closer to connecting to that field. And people need to know that, and they need to witness it, and they need to see it, because it means then it's possible for them to have that same exact experience. So I think we're saying the same thing, and it's just beautiful that we come to those conclusions in the same way.
And that's what I find so interesting, Joe, is that we've used different mechanisms and are finding the same result, which really talks about a truth that is being uncovered. And for me, I've started with the small groups and large groups and really looked at and studied that phenomenon. And what's been really fascinating for me looking at power of 8 groups, when we did our neuroscience studies on these groups, we took a group of novices. They were students. Most of them had never even meditated before, let alone been in a power of 8 group. And we put them into these groups and we measured their brain waves. And it was shocking what happened, because we expected them to look a certain way and they were completely different. What happened for them was a global quieting of the parts of the brain that are involved with feeling separate from the world. You know, distinguishing self from not self. That's like the parietal lobes. And another big feature, and there were some other areas also that were the separation parts of the brain that were just that volume was turned way down. Then we also had parts of the frontal lobes that are involved with worry, doubt, negativity. They were all turned right down. These were brainwave signatures that were virtually identical to the brainwave signatures recorded by Dr. Andrew Newberg when looking at Sufi masters and Buddhist monks in ecstatic prayer. And these were total novices. They had a short bit of information from me about how to do this. But there was something about this group experience that was a transport to the miraculous. And here's the thing that I think that I've been studying and looking at. As I mentioned to you before, one of the real interesting things is, of course, there's a group effect. I mean, Emile Durkheim once defined groups. The famous social psychologist, a French social psychologist, said that there's a collective effervescence when groups come together, large and small, where you are lost in the group kind of thing. But there's something far more than that that's going on in these little power of 8 groups that we've measured and studied. The first thing I think is, of course, there's the group effect. Of course, there is intention. In the group intention, there's also brainwave resonance, heart coherence. When a group comes together and they do something altruistic, as you say, their hearts start going, and their hearts start rhythmically beating in tune. And the same thing with their brainwaves; they are synchronizing. But there's something more. As I said earlier, altruism is like a bulletproof vest. One of the things that's been really interesting for me is looking at the science of altruism. For instance, I looked at this prayer study, and this was done by a psychologist priest who wanted to see whether or not prayer could affect mental illness as well as physical illness. There's some decent studies on prayer affecting physical illness, but not on mental illness. So we got together 400 people with chronic depression, divided them into 2 groups. And one group were going to be the ones that got the prayer. And the other group were taught to be the ones who were going to be the ones who give the prayer, who do the praying. And then he used all kinds of psychological parameters to sort of look at them afterward. And he found that the people who got the prayer got better, definitely, by all kinds of parameters. But they were nowhere near as good as the people who had done the praying. Those people were off the charts in terms of being healed. And when I started looking at the science of altruism, I found exactly that. People who do for other people in any regard live longer, are healthier, are happier, are more fulfilled in every way. And they also have that ability to just get off of themselves. And I started experimenting with this with my Power of 8 groups. I run a thing called a master class intention masterclass. I run just one all year. I teach people for 7 weeks, and then I put them in groups of 8, and I study them. And I have them work with each other for a whole year. So I did this several years ago, and really this was my own petri dish. I monitored them month by month to see how they were doing in terms of their health, their relationships, their career or hobby, and their life's purpose. And we looked at them minutely month by month by month. And here was the extraordinary thing about it. Of the people who met regularly every week, met together, and that was about, I think in the end, it was about 2/3 of the group. I started out with a small group of 250. So it was about 2/3 of that group. Virtually 100% of them, 100% had major, miraculous, transformational changes in their lives. One guy who had chronic fatigue, or one woman who had chronic fatigue for 15 years is now lifting weights, and she melted away some breast lumps. Another guy with lifelong depression ended. We had also, aside from hearing, some woman regained her hearing, another woman repigmented with big vitiligo. We had tons of people like that. But we also had people who were stuck in their career, and suddenly, out of nowhere, they got new jobs, dream jobs. They started new entrepreneurial endeavors, and they were successful. They wrote best-selling books. They got financial windfalls out of nowhere, or they reestablished relationships and connected with estranged relatives. They were connecting again, and all of them rediscovered the joy in their lives. So this was extraordinary to me, but some of them didn't. A few of them didn't when we were halfway through the course. And there was one woman, for instance, Andy. Andy was going through a divorce, and she'd sold her gift shop, and she wanted to create new income stream, and she needed it. And everything she was trying was not working. All the intentions of her group, and they were meeting all the time, intending for her all the time, totally not working. And so I even had her send intention back to seed moments when she was first discovering a feeling of scarcity, and we worked on that. That didn't work. So I finally just said, Andy, get off of yourself. Just stop intending for yourself. Intend for this young boy over here. And a stepfather had written me about a little young guy called Luke, who was 15 and had broken up with his first major girlfriend, and in a fit of adolescent angst had thrown himself off a structure onto hard ground. And Luke broke every bone in his body, and he got nerve damage and brain damage, et cetera, et cetera. So we do intentions of the week anyway with my community, but we started doing intentions for Luke over 3 weeks, and Luke got out of the hospital in record time. He lived, he got out of the hospital in record time, he healed. It was amazing. Maybe that was good doctoring, maybe it was us. But what was more interesting was what happened to Andy, because Andy, after as soon as she started getting off of herself and intending for Luke, out of nowhere came a phone call with a dream job from somebody she didn't even know. And that again happened over and over and over again. When people got off of themselves, their lives started working. And it was too often to be coincidental. It was, I think, an essential part of it. And I'm not talking about altruism. We think of altruism as a Hallmark card, do unto others, a sappy little idea. I'm giving to my local charity. I'm talking about getting what you said, Joe, of just getting off of yourself, getting out of your own life, getting out of your own way. And suddenly everything opens, the floodgates open, and things start to work.
Mm. And I think that mechanism is, getting beyond yourself. Or I think the act of creation is when you forget about yourself. And when you forget about yourself, of course, you're no longer local in space and time. And I think that's what begins to cause us to really begin to connect. And the altruistic effect that seems to be consistent is that when people start feeling those feelings, they're more prone to give they're more prone to take care of, they're more prone to forget about themselves more and more. And the biological consequences of that, of course, cause oxytocin levels to go up, and then oxytocin signals nitric oxide, and nitric oxide causes the arteries in your heart to literally swell, and all of a sudden your heart feels more full, and that center becomes more activated, and then now you want to do more of that because it begins to feel good. And so I think there's a delicate balance in of course, speaking from my present state of ignorance, between intention and surrender. I think intention is getting clear on what we want, and then surrendering is getting out of the way and trusting something greater to begin to organize our lives for us. And that means then that we've been so conditioned to try to affect matter with matter, our bodies in space and time. And yet it's interesting, because when we get beyond that conditioning process and we're no longer trying or forcing, we're laying down the very thing we used our whole life to get what we want for something greater to occur. And some of us have to go to such, and I know this because I've done it in my own journey. You intend, and when you start over-intending, you're trying. And if you over-surrender, then you're lazy and lethargic, and you're not making the effort. So it's kind of this razor's edge of seeing it, getting clear on what it is, and then just opening your heart and trusting that a greater mind, a greater intelligence is going to do it for you. Now, that's scary for a lot of people, because that takes them from their known level of understanding into the unknown. And we've been conditioned and hypnotized into believing that the unknown is a scary place. Hold on to your guilt. Hold on to your suffering. Hold on to your pain. Hold on to your problems. And really try to change them, but never getting beyond the familiar emotions and the familiar habits. And so then stepping out into that unknown is when you finally just go, I give up. And when you finally let go and give up, you're in the unknown. And that's where the miraculous happens. And I've seen it over and over again when people just get to the end of their belief, whether it's emotional or neurological. They come to the end of their belief, and they've given everything they possibly could give. Whether you're a successful millionaire or billionaire, or the person who just wants to score the right job, or the person who wants to heal, when you come to that end and you finally surrender and you say, I don't know, or I can't do this any longer, I just give up, that is the moment that something greater begins to step in, because now you're no longer trying. You've let go and surrendered completely. Now, I think this is a concept that we can only talk around and until you keep practicing and doing this. And we're programmed into forcing and controlling outcomes. It's a great conversation, because people are doing it more the more they understand that the knowledge behind all the things that we're doing, that knowledge actually becomes the forerunner to the experience. And so we've seen in the same exact way that when people start to open their heart and they start to create heart coherence, that they start emitting that field, that their energy begins to resonate or begin to intersect with the person's next to them. And when those two waves come together, they create a bigger wave. And the bigger the wave, the higher the amplitude, the higher the energy. And we've seen in just a very short amount of time, when we've measured the energy in the room, significant changes in the energy in the room. And now there's energy in the room as a group, that there can be healings, that there can be mystical experiences, there can be shifts in people's lives, because they're tapping into that virtual network of information. And what happens then is that people that are non-local, that are wearing their heart rate monitors or brains being scanned, they start going into coherence at the exact same time, in the exact same day, in the exact same meditation. So what's the relevance of that? Well, just like the intention experiment, when you start doing a global peace projects, and your interest is to begin to produce an outcome or an effect in the world, it's doing something for somebody other than yourself. And when our students saw that type of coherence taking place in many of the students that were receiving that energy, they of course said, well, let's go ahead and see if we can have an effect on the world. And so we've done some Project Coherence where we've gotten people together, 42,000 in our last project, to really begin to see if we can produce some type of effects in an automatic or an autonomic way. In other words, the moment you start feeling love, and the people in your life that you're connected to, your family and your friends, if you're truly connected to them, as your heart goes into coherence and your brain goes into coherence, you begin to produce autonomic changes in their body non-locally, which means all of a sudden they just may feel love. All of a sudden they just may feel joy. They all of a sudden may just feel lifted. And that kind of effect can begin to become global, where it starts to resolve all kinds of issues for a lot of people. And I think, I know you've done some you've done several intention experiments, and we were talking about the last intention experiment that you did in the Middle East, and why don't you tell everybody about that?
Well, I was just thinking that, Joe, of just this whole idea of coherence and what happens. We decided to do one with involving Arabs and Israelis. So I had access to a studio in southern England that had 9 different screens. So we had the ability to have cameras in 9 different places. And we had them in audiences in 8 different Arab countries, and then 1 audience in Israel, in Jerusalem. And we all sent intention, and it was broadcast live stream through my YouTube channel. And we sent intention to the old city of Jerusalem because it's kind of historic and it's symbolic. It belongs to no one, it belongs to everyone, and all religions have really started there. And so we sent the intention to lower violence, and we'll measure it later. We have some interesting measurements demonstrating coherence through various kinds of effects. But that isn't even the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story came after we finished, and I had the ability to speak to all 9 screens, plus call on them, and they could talk to each other too. The Arabs started sending love to the Israelis. And you have to understand that most of the Arabs who were there from Jordan and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and all of those places have never seen an Israeli before. They think that they have horns growing out of their heads. And they sent love to the Israelis. The Israelis were crying and saying, "Your God is my God." It was historic. And it went all over the internet. It was in the Israeli press. It was in a lot of the Arab press. And suddenly it was making a difference. It had one little ripple breakthrough of emotion and connection between people who had been enemies. And that also, I found the science for that. When the vagus nerve gets fired in an altruistic activity like this, it's been demonstrated in a lot of research that also makes people more tolerant of people not like them, more tolerant of the other. And so we started looking at this. This happened before with an intention experiment I ran at the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I had Muslims and Americans coming together and sending intention to lower violence in Afghanistan. And there was some good, compelling data that we may have had an effect from NATO. Not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part came watching the Arabs sending love and caring to the Americans, and the Americans forgiving the Arabs. It was extraordinary. So part of what I'm finding with Power of 8 groups and the large groups, that group effect is a kind of an instant transport to a changed state, to the miraculous. Here's the interesting part of Power of 8 groups that I have found after studying them all this time. Now it's 10 years. And the intention experiment around the same time. You don't need ayahuasca. You don't need a sweat lodge. You don't need years and years of training. What I have found is just putting people in little groups. As you talked about before, Joe, it's our natural state of being. We need to be connected. We need that more than food. It is our lifeline, essentially, to a fulfilled life. And people don't experience that in this life anymore. People don't experience that. They experience isolation. They're brought up on a diet of I win, you lose, that kind of mindset. So to suddenly be in a connected group, many of my masterclass people, many of the people in my Power Break groups, and I've got thousands of them now on my website, in my forums, starting to grow, and they have said that the group. One woman said the group is like my intention family, and another person said the group intention was like a soup that slowly changed my brain. And that I thought of you when I was hearing stuff like that, because this kind of group effect has this amazing effect on the brain, and it has that effect on the person's life, not just on their health, but on every aspect of their life. And, I always look for proof and for everything that I try to do. I've still got that investigative reporter mindset, but a part of me has stopped being such a doubting Thomas and really come to accept there's an X factor here that is possibly beyond our understanding. We know that there is this that happens to the vagus nerve, and there's maybe more of this that's firing, but there is something alchemical about people coming together in groups, people in praying together, which is really an intention, people surrendering together, and people just connecting in that amazing way.
Sure. And wow, I mean, it's so interesting because so many people now are craving that. I know that just the most common thing that we see in terms of feedback in our community is that community is the most important thing. You get a group of people together, a large group of people, a small group of people, and they're all striving to overcome themselves. They're all connecting, they're practicing, they're changing. It creates kind of this kind of connection beyond space and time, and all of a sudden, people who start resonating in that same frequency, they want more of it. It's intoxicating to them, and the concept in biology called emergence is always one of my favorite concepts, because if you think about human beings as a species, we're so disconnected in so many ways. And yet, if you look at a flock of birds or a school of fish that are all moving as one mind, that concept, you think that there's one leader that everybody's following, that it's a top-down phenomenon. And in fact, there's no leader. If you study it, it's a bottom-up phenomenon. Everybody's leading at the same time. They're connected as one mind, and they appear as one because they're all moving in the same way. And so I think that when people start to really begin to understand that the species that we called human beings, we're in some type of trouble here because we're always at war with one another. We're always undermining each other. We're always afraid. Those survival states keep us separate from that energy and separate from one another. And too many things in our life remind us of that. But that's not our nature. So what a great time to be alive, because the evidence that we're discovering points the finger that a species can come together in cooperation, collaboration, in connectedness, in support, in love, and really understand that we have to begin to take care of one another as a species and move together as one mind. And evidence-based studies like we're doing really helps people understand that it is possible, because you're not going to see it on television. You're not going to see much of it in the world around us. We're going to see it in people who are really going to make the time out of their busy lives to really practice this, and making it a skill and getting better at it. I mean, when you heal others, you get ready, because on some level you're going to heal yourself. And so then why wouldn't you want to do that? I mean, it's an amazing concept. And so we're seeing this emergence of this new consciousness, and we're seeing this emergence where people no longer want to feel that way any longer. They want to feel connected, and they want to be part of a community, and it's that community that is healthy for the brain. It's that community that's healthy for our immune system. It's that community that's resonating as one mind that begins to cause a field effect and changes in people's lives, because they're no longer preoccupied in separation. They're striving for connection. And I think that the act of doing that enough times begins to become a skill. And I love that, because now you're no longer waiting for science to give you permission to do it. I think that when we do that, we make science another religion. I think we're seeing that people are going out and doing it over and over again. And because of that, science has to catch up with what we're doing and seeing that this has always been part of our nature. And so great time to be alive. And hopefully you and I, on some level, are making a difference in the world.
I think we are. I hope we are too, Joe. I think what we're both trying to do, we've got certain differences in the path to getting there, but we're finding a very similar situation. And I think both of us, our message is also that it's fairly simple to do this. It doesn't really take years of training. I know in my book, I have a simple blueprint of how to create a group and how to carry out these things, a Power of 8 group in your life. I know you've done many things about how to use meditation to create major changes in your own life. And so I think that's the real big takeaway message too, is, you know, you don't need years of practice. You don't need to completely transform the day job. You know, in my view, all you need is a group and an intention. Sure. And watch miracles happen. And for you, it's really, you know, all about of your own way and just following some of your extraordinary meditative techniques too.
Well, I think this is hope. We've covered a lot of ground in an hour, and gosh darn it, we could probably talk for 3 hours, you and I, and we do when we see each other. So, so anyway, so hopefully we've changed a few minds and opened a few hearts in this process.
It's been great spending time with you, Joe, and with everybody else. Thanks so much for listening.
Sure, thank you too. Ciao, ciao.